What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, your nuclear barbarian, Emmett Penny, and today I've got an exciting episode where I'm going to learn a lot and ask dumb questions about transmission and distribution because I have Bryce Johanneck, a grid operations guy, here to talk to us. What is up, Bryce? Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, hey, great to be talking to you. Happy to be here. Yeah, all is good. I think we can cover some interesting topics.
Yeah, I believe so too. So before we get into that, like, what is your background? What does grid operations guy mean, and how did you level up to grid operations guy? Because I know that you've been in the game for a while.
Yeah. 2006, I went to line school. It was a 10-month program right out of high school and tested out of my first year of my apprenticeship books while going to line school, which was sort of an unusual offering. And, was fortunate enough to pass the first year test. So then had, what amounted to 3 more years of an apprenticeship. So 4 years in total of book work and on-the-job training. And, 2009-10 became a journeyman lineman working in central Minnesota on the distribution system. And then 2014, made a little career change. Obviously wanted to stay in the industry, but wanted to learn more. Made it work with the family situation and started working in a distribution control center. So, was functionally a distribution system operator, right? Not the economic DSO concept that gets often talked about and, is or may become a real thing, but, but a distribution system operator working, rotating shifts, sitting in a control room, working with linemen. And, that was in a pretty small utility, but a very advanced one in the upper Midwest. And, you kind of end up wearing many hats and ended up kind of moonlighting at night while at work as an AMI DBA or a smart meter, database admin, sort of tasked with, making the system work, the metering communication system work, and then B, leveraging the meter data, the measurement data. And that turned into a full-time gig at that same utility, but again, was a many hat type thing. So I started working in the meter shop, which is kind of a unique corner of a utility world that really nobody gets exposure to unless, you work in the meter lab.
Unless you're deep in it, yeah.
Yeah, so, meters are abstract and electrical measurements are abstract. And big, large commercial metering services are abstract and obscure, but so functionally became, a journeyman meterman as well, wiring up 50 kVA to, 20 megawatt metering installations. And then the DBA aspect of that job required enough that after several years, was a full-time AMI DBA and meter data user, which kind of led me into the, distinction between meter measurements and relay measurements, like SCADA relay measurements, and started thinking about the distinctions and the unique properties of each, and learned that, hey, I'm dealing with what's known as asynchronous data, and I want to learn about what's better, and that's known as time synchronous data in the T&D world, synchrophasers, phaser measurement units, those types of things. So that was probably 2018, 2019, and yeah, I connected myself with some people leading the space and said, hey, I need to be working with you to learn more about this. And so here I am today.
Man, that's fantastic. It's cool to talk to somebody that's actually been a lineman and has been out in the field, like seeing how the stuff is actually physically working out there. I think, this would be a criticism of myself as well, but I know that you and I have agreed that it would be nice if there was a little bit more of that in the energy space rather than map territory conflation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a hard thing, and it's valid and due to a lot of historical reasons that are outside of everybody's control, but kind of ends up being a systems problem that we have a lot of theorists and even practitioners in their own space who've never actually worked on a power grid, and obviously there's a big safety component that comes along with that. So nobody can just be thrown into it. But as I've said, and people have probably heard me say elsewhere, if you're studying the ocean, you may be living on a ship and working on or in the ocean. But if you're studying the power grid, that's not the same. And that kind of contributes to a lot of shortcomings, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So let's sort of, before we get to some what those shortcomings might be and how to think about it, let's talk about T&D in general. Like, what is it? How does it work? And we'll have some other questions after that. So let's get into that first, just brass tacks.
Yeah, no, solid question. And yeah, happy to chat about it. T&D is the electric grid. So, I guess I would just start by saying that anytime And so often I hear people saying, grid this, grid that.
Mhm.
But when you dig into the article and you dig into what they're saying, they may be talking about an asset that's connected to the electric grid, right?
Mhm.
Or an asset that's connected to T&D is another way of putting it,
Mhm.
right? Generation is not the electric grid.
Mhm.
Behind the meter assets are not the electric grid, or any entity representing a subset of the grid is not the
Mhm.
electric grid, right? ISOs, RTOs are not the grid. Reliability coordinators are not the grid. Utilities, community charge aggregators, none of these are the grid, right? It is the physical infrastructure that, to think of it backwards, because it's easier for people, starts at your meter socket and goes up, right? Upline
Mhm.
to substations via a bunch of switches, and then back up to transmission circuits, again via a bunch of switches, and eventually make it back to multiple generation sources, right? Nuclear plants, any of the generation sources we're familiar with. So that's the grid from my perspective, right? And the important reason to denote that it's not anything else than that is because everything else than that gets conflated when we
Mhm.
say the grid literally represents, a single digit percentage, of that infrastructure, if that, right? Generators
Mm.
don't represent the grid, but, ISOs, RTOs, reliability coordinators, even any individual utility, right? That's all, representing a fraction of a percent or a percent of the T&D infrastructure as a function of installed assets and line miles. So
Right. So, first of all, that's very eye-opening because I didn't know that it was such a, I knew that obviously T&D is huge, but I didn't know that generators were such a small sliver of what's going on there. I'm certainly guilty of sort of the colloquialism of using grid to talk about it. So I'm happy to have some technical clarification here on what it actually is. So let me just ask you this then. What are the reasons why you think people misunderstand what the grid is?
yeah, that's a really good question. I think because nobody has exposure to it,
Mm.
right? The exposure people have to the grid is, either from the windshield, or from, their day job, which
Mhm.
if they aren't a lineman, they're not working on the grid, right?
Mhm.
And that's it. I mean, you can shoehorn metermen in there, but that's a really small fraction of employees, right? I think we have maybe 150,000 linemen in this country, and I don't know, 20 to 40, maybe 50,000 system operators,
Mhm.
right? Even the system operators, they're not, you know, and again, I'm talking about the system operators at utilities. They're working on the grid functionally, right, from a desk. They're not, out touching the things, and the devices that they have visibility to are a fraction of a percent of the installed devices. So, I guess that's the reason that I think it's sort of missed is because nobody has visibility to it. Nobody can gain that tacit knowledge without working on it, and working on it is a commitment, right? It takes,
Mhm. Yeah.
24 months to be able to work on it within close supervision of somebody who's got 4 years of qualifications. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's a profession, right? Like it's, and it demands a close attention, especially it's not a casual pursuit,
right,
right?
right.
Because the
Yep,
stakes are high. It has to work, you know.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the stakes are high. It's, you don't have, you know, minutes or even seconds to think about your decisions when you're working on it. And that's sort of we kind of talk about, a lot of the operations functions of what may be known as a system operator as if they're kind of making fast decisions and working quickly. And they are. I mean, that's
Mhm.
not about discrediting anybody's work, but when you see a lineman in a bucket truck and he's got, half his body between 15,000 volts,
Mhm.
he doesn't have time to, consider what's going to happen 5 minutes later.
Mhm.
He's working real time with something that operates at 60 hertz, and hertz or kills at 60 hertz, or at minimum, the constraints on the grid are exceeded in ones, tens,
Mhm.
or hundreds of cycles at 60 hertz. So just kind of end up like with this disconnect between, how the physics actually work and what theorists kind of talk about.
Right. So let me ask you about that because that's fascinating to me. It's something that I think about a lot. I'm about to give sort of a talk about energy and the energy transition to some peers in Colorado. And I've been thinking a lot about like what to talk to them a lot. I've been thinking a lot about map territory stuff. I've been thinking about how we think about energy. So let me put it to you this way. What do you notice is the consequences of this disconnect between the people doing this work and theorists?
You know, I mean, the worst case is, you can end up with, you know, policy or decision makers that are disconnected from reality and not due to their own any one individual's shortcomings, right? It's due to a systems problem.
Mhm.
But that can contribute to, negative externalities that get born those using the system.
Yeah.
And it's a
So
simple
what's an example, would you say? Like, even if it's just in theory or just, not to, I'm not asking you to like name names, Bryce, but like give us an example so we can flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've dedicated my career to solving the technical challenges with proliferating, variable distributed assets across T&D infrastructure. And it has been, a one-man show for the better part of, maybe 4 or 5 years now, saying like, look, nobody knows how this machine is electrically connected at any given timestamp. And, what are the implications for proliferating distributed assets due to that known, right? Again, this is all physics. So, I know the electric grid and the T&D infrastructure can be kind of obscure because we don't have access to it, but it's really no different than your house, right? I mean, could you plug a bunch of things into your outlets, a bunch of generation sources into your outlets, and use energy on via different outlets or different circuit breakers that are fed out of your panel and not exceed the constraints of the wiring between them? I mean, you don't know. You don't know, which circuit breaker is feeding every outlet, and you don't know, exactly what other loads are on that same circuit. So the T&D infrastructure just sort of is that problem, multiplied by many factors. So
it's hard to see. Well, and the other thing that I'm thinking of is like, the fashionable way to, and I've heard our mutual friend Mark Nelson talk about this, that things like the levelized cost of energy, like don't actually factor in transmission, even as like a financial cost.
Right.
For a generator on the grid. So I think there's sort of a problem there too, in that like the way we approach how we're going to sink capital into generators that need to be connected to the grid, and it doesn't factor that in, seems to be another problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, right? And I'm certainly not an expert on many economics things. I've sort of kept myself more on the physics side of the business because that's what I know. But of course, I've helped out with plenty of economic analysis in the course of my career, right? I mean, that is part of a function of using metering data. So yeah, like any of the infrastructure that you ignore, either intentionally or inadvertently, which I think much more often it's inadvertent. I mean, I don't like to think people are malfeasant, but I mean, it just ends up as a negative externality, right? And at the end of the day, these things, they're not really movers, like, because people know, and we just need to do better. So well, do better.
Right. So let's talk about that. Like, what are the problems that you see like facing the grid today? Right. And by that, I mean, in the strict sense, the T&D.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of big problems and a lot of people working on them. And all of them deserving of, attention and more attention in their own right. The biggest one, and of course it's near and dear to my heart, but the biggest one that I see in terms of, solutions and as a function of, attention upon it right now, is that whole indeterminate T&D connectivity piece. State estimation, and that this gets into wonky topics quickly, but state estimation is challenging. Knowing how electrical infrastructure is coupled at any given timestamp is a real problem that's had a ton of academic effort put toward it for years. And once you end up with kind of multiple unmonitored junctions between monitored ones, things devolve quickly. And so I think solving that whole indeterminate connectivity piece sufficiently, I don't really know that the focus is there. There's a big gap. So
let me get, as a complete layman, let me see if I can sort of figure out what you've just said. Is that you have multiple assets on the grid, they're the grid being the T&D, and it is I always joke, I'm like, there's no like electrical sommelier that can be
Right.
like, yes, this kilowatts from
Right.
coal in New
Right.
Hampshire, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like
That's
that's
right.
not, yeah, that's not happening. And so because of that, you can't always know what's connected to what, when, and how much even power is moving between those things, perhaps, right? So there seems to be this whole field that would be important for things like reliability, because you need to stay at 60 hertz, where you're trying to understand that coupling and have deeper insight into it. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, the implications are far ranging, right? Like,
Mhm.
again, nothing I ever say is to knock anybody, but we
Sure.
can look at like a lot of the corporate effort toward clean procurement goals
Mhm.
and attainable. Some of the best today is like getting more granular, right? Like
Mhm.
I've seen some stuff about like, oh, true clean is going to be when we reconcile our clean energy procurement at an 8760 granularity, right? So
Mhm.
every hour of the year, this corporation is going to say I procured energy from a clean source, and that's all great, right? Like before that, we were just doing some sort of less finite analysis, right? We were
Mhm.
reconciling at something measured in days or months or years. So ours is certainly better.
Mhm.
But on the flip side, it's like, okay, well, let's not forget that we operate at 60 hertz, not sub 1 hertz if we're doing
Mhm.
something every hour. And then similarly, you can't ignore the connectivity component, because the minute you ask those people, okay, well, where did you procure it from?
Right.
We start talking about geospatial things, like,
Mhm.
well, it was within my state, or it was within my region, or it was in my, nobody even says
But
county.
right, but what makes up the region?
Right.
Like that's sort of the question there, where it's like, okay, but again, like you would have to be so specific to
Right.
know, I mean, it moves in microseconds.
That's right.
So
That,
to say like in aggregate, it's kind of like, well, that's a load bearing, if anything's load bearing.
that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And another line that people may have heard me say before, but it's like the electrons are taking the wires to work,
Mhm.
not the streets and not the air. So,
Mhm.
the geospatial location of things isn't really that important. Like,
Mhm.
it is important, the geospatial, location of electric assets and other things connected to T&D is important, but it's secondary to the electric location of the things, right? So
So unpack that a little bit for me. I don't think I quite understand you. So what would be the difference between the geospatial and the electric location of something? I think that's a
yeah,
fascinating distinction.
yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that it resonates, because some people grasp it and some don't. But geospatial location is a physical location, where something's
Mhm.
located on the earth, in space. It may be a street address, it may be ideally coordinates, GPS coordinates. Both are helpful, when
Mhm.
mapping or connecting electrical assets, but they're secondary to the electric location, right? And again, we just think of that in a parent-child, context, like,
Mhm.
for the outlet in your house, if you had a unique identifier for every physical connection between it and your electric panel, you know, what would those parents be working its way back up line? And,
Mhm. Mhm.
and you know, th those definitions are ambiguous. They're full of, you know, variability and interpretation, because everybody has, you know, unique naming schemes. And if you walk into a commercial building, you may see outlets labeled with a label maker at the top, right? It may
Sure.
say
Yeah.
circuit whatever,
Mhm.
breaker this, but all of that verbiage is very ambiguous and sort of not defined and not standardized. And those same problems just exist, when you move up. And
Mhm.
at the end of the day, it gets to be about parent-child relationships. That's the kind of the best
Right.
starting
Okay.
point.
So I think I hear you right. Like geospatial is easy. It's like it's down the block, like that type of thing. It's at these coordinates. I got that. Electric location is about what it's connected to,
Right.
like physically which power lines are touching this thing
Right.
and bringing it that way, and that there's basically, I'm sure, like whole like matrices of electric connectivity location that we're looking at that have to come from geospatial locations, but when you're looking at them, you're not looking at the coordinates, you're looking at the connections.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And for listeners, depending on their background, another kind of helpful way to think about it is contrasting it with like data networks or other, I mean, even roads, right? Roads are a network. And you sort of get into like this, single active path versus multiple active path distinction, with the latter arguably defining a network, right? Network being to something with multiple active paths, right? I can drive to the grocery store different ways unless I happen to live on a dead end road and the grocery store is on my dead end road. So, the electric grid is functionally not a network, right? It is a single active path machine with a ton of redundancy built in. And so you end up, using that redundancy via the, 200,000 humans we talked about before to make sure everybody's lights stay on when you have to do planned or unplanned work. But that knowledge doesn't really make it any further than those 200,000 people doing the work.
Right. Okay. So while listening to you, I had a thought, and then I have sort of a clarifying question. So the thought is that it's sort of like a power line goes down. I can look at an electrical map to figure out which power line it is and maybe what generation sources can't be sourced now or are complicated by that. Just like I can sort of figure out maybe where it can't go now that it's down. That's the electric location. And then in order to fix it, I need to know the geospatial location so I can go there and do it. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. So then the clarifying question I have is, I'm very fascinated by this because I think people use, and I've probably done this actually, the phrase network to describe the grid very carelessly.
Oh yeah.
And you've said single active path entity or whatever noun you use there. Unpack that a little bit. What does that mean?
A single active path is, I guess, what it sounds like, right? Like a data network has multiple active paths, right? My, computer gets information to your computer via multiple different sets of connected infrastructure, but we have routable communication protocols that define where my information goes and then it goes to you. The inverse of that is the electric grid that, functionally really is just one active path, right? My house right now is only being fed by one feeder breaker in a given distribution substation. And but it can have different ones upline because we have a lot of redundancy built in for planned and unplanned work or planned and unplanned events. So yeah, I mean, I think that's really the distinction. I had another thought on it. I lost it at the moment, but it'll come back.
Sorry. Yeah. If it comes back, we'll get on it. Okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense, right? Because it's not necessarily like it has to be single path and that it's like the electricity is going out towards a place, and even if supply and demand are being like balanced at all times in a way, it's not necessarily, though I think this is sort of a dream people have, that the houses are then feeding power back into it necessarily. Certainly not at the level where it's like this totally dynamic, everything swapping between itself scenario.
Right. That's exactly it. Of course, energy exports to the grid. I mean, that's how any exporting asset
got to come from somewhere.
Does its job, right? And the same is true for rooftop solar or something. If you have 5 kW on your roof and you have less than 5 kW load in your house, it's going somewhere and it's taking the path of least resistance. But yeah, to kind of say that it's definable at a very granular level is kind of a misnomer to this kind of indeterminate connectivity issue. And again, it's not to really blow a hole in any existing practices or say that
Sure, no, we're just talking about like the physicality of the system. We're not taking shots. We're not taking an ideological stance. We're just like, this is literally how it works. Take it or leave it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, at some point these things are definable, and the way they've been defined for years, arguably has been working from a physics perspective, right?
Right.
We have had issues where we have frequency deviations and events that occur that collapse grids, but functionally that is how it works. And that's this issue is kind of why it really isn't a two-way thing, because there's unknown constraints between.
So let me ask you a question that's maybe a little bit more like social or something like that. You've talked a lot about how it's just a numbers game. Not a lot of people know this. Not a lot of people touch this stuff, and you kind of have to do that in order to really be aware of what's going on at a granular level. What's it like out there in the field now? I know you're no longer a lineman, but I'm sure you have buddies that still are, or whatever, you're in touch with people. Sort of like what's it like out there? What's the life of a lineman? like? What do people not necessarily understand about it? I think even more visibility into the actual work is important too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a great profession,
Mhm.
great trade. And I am a huge advocate of, people going to trade school. So if there's, anybody, I won't even just say young people because, I went to line school with people who were in their mid 30s and I know people who become linemen, after that. So it is truly a phenomenal profession. It's very organized, and I'm not talking about any, you know, union representation or non. I'm just saying it's a brotherhood. It's a really tight knit group of guys who
Mhm.
are all doing the same work, and your skills are really transferable because
Mm.
the electric grid is the electric grid everywhere, right, globally.
Right.
So
Yeah, yeah.
you
The
know,
physics stays the same, luckily.
yeah, yeah, that's exactly it, and it's been well defined over the course of 100 years. And if you go to work in it now, you're working in it in the best time it's ever been, of course. Like something like 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 linemen used to die on the job, in the
Oh
late
yeah.
1800s.
Oh, if you read some of Edna Tarbell's, the famous muckraker, some of her journalism from like the early 19th century, I think late 19th, early 20th, like she's always just like such and such lineman was killed by monopoly,
Yeah,
and you see
right,
right, and you see sort of like the sky just looks clotted with
yeah,
line infrastructure,
yeah,
and it's like linemen didn't even know necessarily what they were plugging into or what belonged to who. It's not like you can spray paint like a name on a power line,
right,
like.
right. No, no, right. It's fascinating, and the history on it really is interesting, right? I mean, of course, it's personal for me. My dad was an electrician in
Mhm,
rural Minnesota from 1970 to 1990, and he remembers bringing electricity to a few places, right? And,
mhm.
and of course, the first 15 years of my career were at rural electric cooperatives, which were, that was their core function, right? Was to electrify the rest of America. So there's plenty of politics and history behind that too. But
Mhm.
but to kind of bring it back to like what linemen, what their jobs like today, from 2006, 7 to 2014, we were kind of just getting into like arc flash studies and calorie requirements for fire retardant clothing.
Mhm.
So, I was working with, 20 to 30-year foremen who, used to climb up a pole and set an energized phase on their leather belt that was touching the wooden pole.
Whoa.
Oh yeah, right. Like, and they change out the insulator and and then put a new insulator on and pick the phase back up off their leather belt and tie it back onto the new insulator. That
Good
was the foreman
God.
sitting next to me in 2007, 8, 9, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
and I, again, going to line school in 2006, I learned to
Mhm.
climb without fall restraint. Like this isn't that long,
Mm.
right? So we didn't have fall protection belts that squeeze the pole. We just free climbed or hitchhiked, flipped our non-fall protection belt at the pole while we went. So I only mention that to say, like, things are evolving, and we're going a lot of really good places, right?
Mhm.
And I've dedicated my life to making more of that.
Mhm.
But my career anyway, but maybe my life. Geez, moved my family across the country for this. So anyway, on the flip side, like that's where we just came from, right? Like we're
Yeah,
just
yeah.
finally saying, hey, if you have a fault event, if you're part of an arc flash event on this portion of your distribution feed, this is the calorie that you're going to be the heat calorie you're going to be exposed to. So you need this specific rating on your fire retardant clothing to be safe. So it's interesting to contrast, where we were with, where we're supposedly going
Yeah.
while knowing a little bit about the physics.
Wow, that is wild. I mean, that's really inspiring and heartening to hear. I think like, most news is bad, so it's good to hear
Right.
that there's something improving, especially at the level of workplace safety and just people coming home to their families safe. I mean, you
Yeah.
can't really beat that in terms of improvement.
That
That's
that's
like,
exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
that's like
100%.
top tier stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And again, 2007, 8, 9, we were having, internal healthy discussions about,
Mhm.
should the company be providing, flame retardant clothing for employees, or should 100% cotton still be the standard? And I'm not taking any stances on anybody being right or wrong, but to your point, like, I had a wife to come home to at the time, and now 2
Mhm.
kids too, and so do the majority of the guys doing the work. So yeah, it is. It's really a pretty cool story, and it's yeah, I strongly recommend anybody interested to get into the craft and go out and do the work. There's no better way to learn.
Yeah, that's great. So actually, let me ask you, is there anything I can put in the show notes that would direct people to that if they get inspired?
Yeah, I mean, certainly look up line schools.
Mhm.
You know, there's several. I went to a tech school in Rosemount, Minnesota, Dakota County Technical College, great line school program. But I have buddies who've gone to the other tech schools in Minnesota. I think there's 3 or 4 of them now. 2 when I went, and I've got buddies that went to Northwest Lineman College, who's well known and does a phenomenal job training their guys. I mean, that would have been far superior to the education I had, which mine was great, right? But they're exposing their guys to a lot more than I was exposed to.
Sure.
So yeah, those are certainly 2 good schools. Union apprenticeships are an excellent route. As everybody says, the minute you talk to anybody the first piece of advice they'd give you is be willing to go work wherever, because you can learn a ton and make good money while you're doing it, but you gotta be willing to, be away from home a little bit. And
Right. A semper gumby, always flexible.
that's right. That's exactly right. And really, that's no different than any of us who,
Sure. Yeah.
Any of us are going to go where the money is. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've moved plenty of times in my life, and I was not doing anything like lineman stuff. So that's really fascinating. So let's bring it back to sort of like where you're at now. Like, what are the problems, if you're allowed to talk about it, are you encountering every day? Like, what are you thinking about? What's sort of foremost in your mind when you're thinking about the grid these days?
Yeah. I'm hoping to be talking more about some of my recent or current work in the coming days or months. But right now, I can't say too much about what I'm doing. But what I have done a lot of is built, aside from line work and system operations things, my more recent work has revolved around building, really accurate connectivity models. So, and I'm fortunate, just by chance, when I was at one of the utilities that I used to work at, I, happened to be at the utility that had already done a ton of legwork on making a really accurate connectivity model. And so I really was able to build on that work. I didn't have to do, 10 years of legwork that got them there. So, but I was kind of able to build on that with a colleague who had done a lot of that work. And in almost more of the building on it was just kind of ideating about it more than anything. While we did put a bunch of things in place that made things better, it kind of opened my eyes to like what could be. And so yeah, I mean, that's what a lot of my work for the last, I don't know, since 2017, 18 has been about, and it still is today. There are a lot of business needs for really accurate connectivity models, both technical, right, like a planning and engineering function, operational, being the guys in the control room working with the field people, and economic. There's a ton of economic reasons, as you pointed out, with some of the economic analysis that can be missing some of the factors. So
yeah, the last thing if you're going to fund a project you want is a whole heap of financial externalities that you were not considering. That is the best way to kill a project before it even gets off the ground.
Yeah, 100%. And there's a lot of people that should rightly be interested in those things. And so it's really great to have an opportunity to have this conversation, and people can kind of think of it. The thing I like about it is that people can think of it from any perspective that kind of works for what they're working on, right? Like if you're, somebody doing an LCOE analysis or work, you can think about those things. Or if you're somebody who's, doing line loss calculations, you can think about how, this known trait may adversely impact your work. And I mean, those are 2 gigantically different use cases. And
yeah, totally. But they're so essential. I see these like pie in the sky. Obviously, you don't have to endorse anything I'm saying, so I'll caveat with this. I see these pie in the sky things where it's just like, we'll have this totally connected, like coast to coast, like single line type of thing. And I'm like, buddy,
right.
You better know exactly what you're encountering when you start writing those plans out, because line loss, all the stuff that you're talking about is like, that's the work. It's not the other stuff. That's the work. Like that is the keystone.
That's right.
For execution.
That's right. That's exactly right. And you're working with something that's iterative. So, you can't, it's iterative, and 50% of the infrastructure is not invisible, but it's opaque because it's underground.
Sure. Yeah.
So, you can't see it and get it. I mean, it's like, I see a lot of kind of the digital twin stuff, or, we're gonna tell you exactly everything you need to know about your infrastructure. And it's like, yeah, okay, how? Like, you can't do it by looking at it, and you can't do it by walking it, because 150 to 200,000 people that we've talked about are going to come behind you and change it.
And you can't do it by some, I would guess, say like almost like averaged or algorithmatized sort of like assumption maker.
No.
Because that's not conducive to the physics of the machine.
No, that's right. And to kind of bring that, it's exactly right, but to kind of bring it home and to make it real for people, like think about measuring voltage in your outlets, right? And I remember the topic that we had to move past that I couldn't.
Oh, good. So we'll bring it all back. Yeah.
Yes, because this is exactly fitting here. Is, again, assume you want to know how the electrical wiring in your house is connected, right? You have multiple circuit breakers in your panel, so which ones are feeding which? Well, take a voltmeter, and again, don't work outside your skill set here, but you're going to go and plug a voltmeter into, somebody's calling me. Plug a voltmeter into an outlet, and you're going to get a voltage magnitude measurement. And now, unless you're independently wealthy and you've bought 10 voltmeters and you can go plug them into all your outlets, you're going to pull it out of that one and you're going to go over and walk and plug it into a different one. At which point tens or hundreds of cycles have elapsed because that took you 5 seconds to walk over there. But either way, assume you have voltage magnitude measurements at every outlet and receptacle in your house. Do you think you can tell me which ones are connected to which? Like, what does your sample rate have to look like? What other measurements do you have to have? Like, we can start talking about phase angles in addition to phase magnitudes, because you're only getting the magnitude measurement when you hold a voltmeter in there and look at 120 volts. But you can measure current. You can measure current angles and magnitudes. But just consider a little bit, because you probably have some three-way switches in your house, and as my dad would say, you may have some California three-ways, which are a real actual type of three-way switch that can be wired such that you have two different circuit breakers in your panel feeding one three-way circuit, right? So you have a light functionally that can be fed by two different circuit breakers. And can you discern which circuit breakers upline,
right, and which one is it? Yeah.
Right. And now just extrapolate that problem by a factor of several thousand at least up to the T&D infrastructure, and that's what we're working with. So it's a fun thing. Like, it's a really fun problem space to be in. But yeah, the three-way switch example was what I was thinking of before.
No, that's really great, because that's so helpful for sort of like shedding light on the generation debate.
Yeah.
Right. And I would never ask you to take sides publicly, and I'm not going to go into a spiel now. The title of the show should tell people enough about what I think about that, especially if, I have a listener base, so they all know what I'm about.
Right.
But that should, I would hope, the conversation that we've had here should heighten people's bullshit detector when someone's being serious about what they're suggesting and when they're not. If you just say, I don't care what type it is, we're going to build all this type of generation, it's like, well, good for you.
Right.
But
Yeah.
like, where is it going to be, like, geospatially, and then what's it connecting to and how? Like, that's it. Like, first you have like the community siting, politics, finance stuff, and then the actual building of it, and then you have the hooking it up. And these are not negotiable aspects of this process.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the things we're talking about absolutely touch interconnections, right? And really, that's what you're talking about, right? And even interconnections has sort of been a politicized word, right? Like, then we're only talking about interconnecting certain assets or something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And there's so much more.
Yeah, exactly. At the end of the day, that's what we're discussing here, is interconnecting things to the electric grid, with grid defined as T&D. So, due to the reasons that we've talked about, we can see technically, from a technical perspective, why centralized assets are valuable. And I'm not taking sides and saying, it has to be this type, or even, that we can't kind of flip that on its head a little bit and value distributed assets, or, that we should or shouldn't, right? Because again, I've devoted my life to making that technically functional. Sure. So, but from a historical context and seeing where we need to go, you can see the challenges that we're up against. And it's, there's a lot of talk about malfeasance in the world, and I think, highlighting technical challenges is important, because I think that's good stuff to work on, and that's fun stuff to work on that can, make people.
Well, and it anchors the conversation in solving a problem that has measurable results.
That's right.
I think that's what's so vital about this. Is like, certainly I'm in like the discourse wars for this stuff. But what frustrates me about it is that, it's a lot of bullshit.
That's right.
You
Yeah.
know, like it's just a lot of talking and like,
Yep.
fine, but like, you know, who's going to be responsible for that? Who's going to actually go do it? What's it going to be made out of? Where is it going to go? Like, and in the two senses that we mean, like, these are the questions where it is possible to have a sane discussion
Right.
about what's going on, if anything, because the stakes are clear, the results are clear
Yeah.
comparatively, and
Yep.
like everybody
Yep.
cares about the consequences.
That's right. And we've had a lot of people working on the problem for a long time, right?
Not new.
So, yeah. So, we have people who, you know, say that they're going to solve this or say that they can solve it, or they may not come out and say that directly, but it may be perceived that they can solve it due to communication styles and marketing attempts and those sorts of things. And it's important that we, ask them specifically what they're going to solve, right? Like, how well are you going to define these things? What challenges are you going to run into when you do it? Because the minute you have those types of conversations with those people, and I've literally had multiple of them tell me, well, yeah. I mean, from a grid planning and control perspective, centralization is certainly easier. Like, okay, well, I can't get away with saying that because otherwise I may be the malfeasant guy. So,
Right.
so I can't get away with saying that. I'm here to solve those problems and make sure those who claim to be are. And yeah, it's an interesting road.
Well, that's amazing. Bryce, I really want to thank you for taking time out of your day to talk to me. This
Oh yeah,
was fantastic, and I learned a
thank you.
ton. So where can people find you if they want to reach you?
Yeah, LinkedIn and Twitter. That's it. Yeah, doing a little bit of stuff on Instagram, far less, but yeah, Twitter's active, LinkedIn's active. Those are the best bets. It's my name. It's who I am. So you'll I probably am the only one. So that's it.
Okay, great. So everybody, I hope that was helpful. You can reach out to Bryce if you want. You can reach out to me if you want. And remember, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. We will see you next time.